Good to see you all this morning. I'm glad you're here, and we're coming to that fun time of year where there's lots of food. I told you 3 weeks ago that you had 24 days to lose weight. Now you have 3. And then you can start eating. Hey, there's a lot of different things that are going on. I want to highlight a couple of them because I think they're really important. One is just Thanksgiving, of course, this Thursday. And some of you have already volunteered, but if you are interested in doing anything, there's actually a town outreach that we're participating in at the Cross Building, where we're feeding those who have nothing, homeless people, people that really need something for Thanksgiving. And so we've had some people volunteer to bring some food, bring pies, bring turkeys, but they also need people who will box up the food and then give it away. And so they're doing the boxing up between 11:30 and 1, and then passing it out between 1 and 3. So if you want to be involved in that, you can do that. They also need some drivers because they are delivering some to people who cannot get out. And actually, if you know anybody who would like a meal, even within our family, who would like to have one delivered to them, let me know because I can pass that along, and they can certainly do that. Or you can just deliver them some of your dinner. That's good too. Secondly, if you haven't had a chance, there's merchandise table in the hallway. We have just a couple of things. What we're trying to do is build up a little bit of a brand so that when we're out around and you're taking a sip of your coffee or you're wearing your hoodie this winter, then it has Atlanta Road Alliance Church on it. We let people know where we're from, and they ask, what's that? You can tell them. So if you want to order one of those, we need all those in by next Sunday because then we're going to place the order and have these come in. And the T-shirts are blue, which has absolutely nothing to do with AREC, except that blue seemed to be the most ubiquitous color, and so that's what we took, except for the hoodies, which will be green. All right? So take a look at that, sign up for those on the way out. And then last thing is Christmas is coming up. So if you haven't already done so, December the 23rd is our Christmas service, our Christmas Eve service, which we do on the 23rd because we want to release you to be with family and friends and neighbors and all that on the 24th. And so we're going to be here. I want to encourage you to invite your friends. It's going to be fun. It's going to be uplifting. It's going to be a little bit goofy in places, which means it's not going to be overly intimidating for someone who's not used to church. And we're going to tell you more about it next week, but we're also looking to make it a little bit beforehand, an hour beforehand, where you can actually come, and it's more like a Christmas party that leads into the service. So we're looking forward to that. And then if you're interested, my wife and I have often said we'd love to have everybody in our church family in our house over the course of a year, but it doesn't work that way because there's just not enough time in a year. And so we are going to be hosting an open house at our place the second Sunday in December, starting at 4 o'clock, which is just open to any one of you or all of you that want to come by at any point in time in that to enjoy some good food and just hanging out with some other people. And you can stay as long as you want or stay as little as you want. But we would like to invite you to come to our house. So I just want to get that on your calendar if that's something you'd be interested in. Let's pray before we jump into what God's Word has to say. Lord, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for the reminder of these boxes right in front of us, that you make divine appointments. I mean, you already know where each one of these things is going to go, who they're going to connect with, the people, the kids that they're going to be with, and you arrange it, and you do the same thing in our lives. That you connect us with people, you make supernatural engagements and meetings and encounters because your Spirit's at work. And we want to be people that are prepared for that. So would you use this next little bit of time as an equipping time for us? That we can learn, that we can be challenged, that we can look at life maybe just a little bit different, or maybe just a refresher on what we already know as we go into the weeks ahead. And so we pray this in your name. Amen. All right. When I was a kid, there was a game, it still exists today, and it's a game that some people love. A lot of people, it's the worst thing in life. Okay? Do you know what that is? No. Dodgeball. Now, okay, you have to understand what dodgeball is. Dodgeball is a sanctioned event where you can throw something at other people as hard as you want with the intent to injure, and the adults will clap. Okay? Now, think about that, okay? Now, if you've ever been in a dodgeball game, now let's be honest. These are modern kids' dodgeballs. They're literally the wimpiest things ever, right? I mean, you just throw these. They can't even put a hole in the wall. I was going to throw it at somebody, but then I realized I better not do that. They don't even do anything. But if you're older, you remember the kind of balls that they used to throw. The kind that if they hit you right here, they could kneecap you, right? They could knock you down. And so what I learned over the years playing dodgeball was that there's only like 3 strategies, okay, in dodgeball. Now, one of them is, and you would usually see this from the timid people, they would kind of like stand there and just hope to get hit because they could leave, right? They wanted to go on the sidelines. But there's a risk to that one because you don't know where you're going to get hit, right? And inevitably someone got nailed, right in the face, and, they would get a bloody nose and they would cry. That was one strategy. Second strategy would be to say, I am the aggressor here. And you would be up at the line, you'd be grabbing them all, like, no one has hit me, I'm hitting them first, I'm going after it. That was second strategy. Now, the third strategy was I'm going to go to the back line and get over into the corner, and I'm going to hope that I just get lost in the crowd and no one will throw a ball at me. Actually, there's a fourth strategy, which is just, I'm not going to throw anything, I'm just going to run and dodge and jump all over the place and hope that I'm the last one standing, right? You know those. So you've all played this, if you've ever done this, and you've been in one of those 4 strategies as you did dodgeball. Now, here's the thing. We get older, and the game of dodgeball stops. We don't typically play it anymore. And yet, there are still things that get thrown at us. And while they're not physical, they can actually be more damaging to us than the dodgeballs. Comments, accusations, little statements. And what can happen is, over time, they can accumulate. And if you live with anything like this over time, where you're kind of having this, some of you grew up in this environment, in homes that were like this, and over time, those hits come, and they come over, and they come over. Maybe you live in a work environment where you're getting this all the time, or you've been in one of those where you're just being hit over and over and over, and we tend to adopt the same strategies. We say, you know what? I'm just going to huddle in and hope I don't get hit too hard. But you internalize, and those hits begin to scar you. Or you say, look, I'm not taking this from anybody. And we become experts at insulting back. Or we try to go hide in a corner and try to be unseen. But I wonder if we live and respond that way, that it actually is damaging to us and prevents God from doing the very thing that we want Him to do the most, which is change us on the inside. Well, we're in week 4 of this Tale of 3 Kings, authority, submission, and trusting God plan, by looking at the first 3 kings of Israel. And so what we've seen so far is that God is primarily interested in inner transformation. That's what we saw. And the reason we said this is so important is it's very easy for us to skip over inner transformation and be much more interested in God just doing His thing and making our life easier without actually changing us deeply. In fact, what we really want is for Him to change everybody else deeply so that they all begin to conform to what I want to do. So that's what we do. We don't even think about it that way. We begin to become users of God. And then we saw that one of the barriers then to having this inner transformation was fear, was worry. It was this, I have all these things, I have these deep desires, and I'm so fearful that they're not going to be met, that we begin to live a life that takes control and doesn't let God do His thing, and it actually blocks Him from doing anything in our lives. And so the solution that we saw last week was brokenness. Because God wants people, not who are broken and useless, but people who realize how sinful they are, how much they need Him, and are not putting on a face or an act, but say, God, I need you to do something. And doing it with others. Now, all of that sounds really good in theory. Do you know where it breaks down? Relationships. That's where it stops. There was someone said this to me this week, and it was reminding me of a title of a book, which says, life would be easy if it weren't for other people. Right? Isn't that true? Isn't that true? Now, here's the funny thing is, it's really true because it's really all about other people, isn't it? I mean, we're smart. We're everybody in this room we got it together. So we're the logical thinkers. We're the ones who understand. We're the wise people. So if the people around us could just kind of like get it together, right? If they could just stop doing what they do, if they could just act right, I mean, we see it really clearly. We don't understand why they can't see clearly. I mean, I can perfectly see what you need. Why can't you see what you need? Because if you would just understand it, I mean, this would all work better. And you know what you've experienced? The exact opposite. And your kids, your spouse, your boss, those who work for you, your extended family, they do things that frustrate you to no end. They offend you. They bother you. They generally make life a little bit more uncomfortable than you would like. Because, surprise, surprise, everybody has their own will. And they don't act the way we wish they would. So what do? Because let's be honest, that's where life gets a little bit difficult. What do you do when they don't act the way you want them to? And even worse, when they do things that are specifically directed towards you, that are offensive or bothersome, when they push back, they derail your best intentions, and they stop the things that you want to see happen. What do you do with that? Do we check out? Do we just dodge? Do we fight back? What do we do? See, David, the second king of Israel, understood this perfectly, and probably experienced it in a way that we never had. And there are two events in the early part of this, that in the early part of his life, in his early association with Saul, that actually demonstrate, I think, are incredibly invaluable for us in this. So I call it the art of spear dodging, which you already know then, maybe if you've been in church for a long time, what stories I'm talking about. But we're going to look at these because we're going to see from these experiences. What I want to do this morning is I want to walk through the stories, and then I think there's three applications, three principles that will help us when we're facing that kind of slings and arrows and spears. Make sense? So let's go through them. The first one began as David began to get more and more popular. And if you remember the story, he was anointed king, but nothing really happened until he goes to visit his brothers on the battlefield, and he ends up killing Goliath in this amazing story. And so people began to take notice of who David was. Like, who is this guy? And of course, Saul brought him into his service and said, look, this is the kind of guy I need. I want warriors, I want people. And so here's what we read, and it's in 1 Samuel chapter 18. That's where we've been finding everything. It says, whatever mission, so he pulls David in. As David's getting older, he starts to engage him with his army and with the battles they had. It says, whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. In other words, he went up the ladder. Boom, 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 boom. He was going up. Now look at this. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. That meant all of his fellow grunts, the guys that were doing the hard work, they loved him. And the colonels, the generals, the people that were in charge, they loved him. And the people loved him. Look what it says. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, with timbrels and lyres. Man, isn't that how you want your wives and children to greet you when you come home? Yeah, you're like, this has never happened. Okay, well, this is what happened to David. He's coming back. It's all exciting. They danced, they sang. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Great situation. Not so much. Saul was very angry. And remember, they came out to greet Saul. It didn't say they came out to greet David. It said he came out to greet Saul, but the song they sang gave Saul credit but gave David more credit. This refrain displeased him greatly. He said, they credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. And then he makes this huge leap in logic. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. And David went from being a valued member of his army to someone who was suspected. And then we read this. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul, and he was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre or the harp, as he usually did. Now, we have to pause here for a second to clarify two things. If you're just reading this, it's very troubling, because it says, the next day, an evil spirit from God came on Saul. And you're like, well, hold on a second. How can an evil spirit come from God? God doesn't send evil spirits. So you have to understand the context here. And you have to remember back to what we read about 3 weeks ago. There was a verse we read that said this. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. This is not an accusation that God is causing an evil spirit. So understand that when it says that, what the author is doing is saying, there is something going on here. God has removed his presence from Saul, and what's happening is a spiritual authority and a situation that comes out of the spiritual realm. In other words, this isn't just Saul. There is actually demonic influences. There's something that's coming, and God is letting it happen. He's not stopping it. That's what it means. But then there's a second piece in here, because it talked about him prophesying. Right here, you can see it. It says, this spirit, this troublesome spirit that God is letting happen, comes on while he's prophesying. But you have to understand, in the original Hebrew, there's two different words they used for prophesying. And one of them is what they use when they're talking for God. That's not the word that's being used here. The word that's being used here is actually one, it's different, and it kind of it more relates to like ecstatic utterances. You know, people who just kind of say things that are whatever comes to their brain. You know, and sometimes we picture that when we think of a wild, crazy man who's just spouting things off. That's really what this is talking about. So what's going on here is David is playing his harp, and Saul has this overwhelming darkness, and you know, whether it's depression, whatever it is, the spirit is affecting him, and he's like, I can't believe it, and he's caught in this. I got to do something. I got to fix this. I can't believe it. This person's wrong. He's almost manic in his approach. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Now, David's a smart guy, so this happens, and he realizes, I need to not be here. This is not good, right? He's trying to kill me. So David's like, I got to get out of the king's presence, and so he does. And this is where you find out, if you keep reading the story, that his best friend Jonathan, who is the son of Saul, is a peacemaker. So Jonathan can't stand it that his dad and his best friend aren't getting along, and that's understating it a little bit, because his dad actually said, Jonathan, I want you to kill David. Jonathan's like, why? What's he ever done to you? And so he goes and he says to David, look, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to go talk to my dad. So he goes and talks to his dad. He says, look, David's been nothing but good for you. He's killing your enemies. He's amazing. Why do you want to kill him? You shouldn't do this. This isn't right. And Saul's like, son, you're right. I really shouldn't have. You know what? I promise this will never happen again. You can tell David to come back. It's all good. That was my bad. We're going to do this. And because David trusted Jonathan, he came back. So Jonathan called David, told him the whole conversation. And he brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. The way he used to be. So once more, war broke out. David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. In other words, he was doing what David did. Again, an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. And while David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. And that night, David made good his escape. And just like that, all of Saul's promises were broken. All the oaths he took were useless. And this was the event that precipitated 10 years of running around in the wilderness being chased by Saul. And that whole brokenness that we looked at last week started here, where he had to go on the run. Now, these two events give us amazing insight on how to deal with spear-throwing people. You know that person who talks negatively about you to their other friends. You know the child who actively opposes everything that you want to see happen. The boss who makes your life miserable at work. That ministry leader or that pastor who steps all over your ideas. The one who makes snide comments under their breath. The spouse who passively aggressively makes you feel 2 inches tall all the time. That church person who avoids you or throws you those looks when you're around that makes you think they wish you were dead. What do we do? How do we respond and continue to grow in the middle of this? Because here's the key idea I want you to go away with today. My mistreatment by others can actually contribute to my inner transformation. Not block it, not stop it, but actually contribute to and help me become who God wants me to be. Now, how does that happen? You know, the Jesus answer is, well, trust Jesus. Yep. Live by the Spirit? Sure. Love others? Okay. But what does it look like? And as I was thinking about this week, I thought, we want to put some handles on this. Like, how do we do this? How do we actually, in those situations which we all encounter, how do we still grow? How do we do this? And I think there's 3 principles, as I said, that come out of this. And while David was dodging a physical spear, there was something else going on in his heart that applies to us. So here's 3 things that we can do that will actually contribute to our inner growth when these kind of situations arise. Here's the first one. Avoid retaliation even when you have the power and the right to do so. We read this. Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. Do you know what you do when someone throws a spear at you? You know what the world will tell you to do? Grab the spear, throw it back. I mean, think about what could have happened. Like, they're sitting there. I don't know how big the room was, but Saul throws the spear, and nobody would have blamed David if he threw it back. Right? He dodges. It's in the wall. He could have done this and yanked it out. And remember, David's better than Saul. He's killed his 10,000, David his thousands. He's the leader of the army. This is an accomplished warrior. He could have taken that, spun it around, and sent it right back, and everybody would have said, totally makes sense. He tried to kill you. In fact, David, it wasn't even the first time. You should have done it. Probably would have been just, would have been fair, would have been right, but it would have been wrong. See, we have this thing that when someone wrongs us, when someone does something to us or says something, that every part of us in the inside of us says, I have to respond. I can't just let this lie. This can't just stay this way. And we say things like, oh yeah? Wait till you hear the whole story. Oh yeah? I know all the dirt on you. Yeah? I can ruin your life. You know what? And this is for Christians only. You know what? I'm just going to share this information with a lot of people so they can pray with me. Oh yeah, if that's how you're going to play it, then guess what I'm going to do? But you know, David didn't throw Saul's spears back at him. He didn't grab his own spears and throw them. He didn't retaliate. In fact, it doesn't even look like he defended himself. And if you're a fairness person, every part of you says, I don't want to do this because it's not fair. And do you know how you moved into retaliation mode? Because you can play it in your head. And when you play it in your head, you win. And you've all been there, right? You have this argument, and so you're at home, and you're running it through your head. You're like, oh, you know what? Next time we have a conversation, they're going to say this, and then I'm going to say this, and they're going to be overwhelmed with my logic, and they're going to be like, wow, you're right. And the people that are listening to this conversation on the side are going to go, oh, you were awesome. And you're like, I win. And you're playing this all out in your head, right? When you've done that, and you know this, because retaliation mode is, I'm going to win over them. And this conversation, next time they say that, I'm going to say this. It is going to shut them up because, man, that was good. Right? You know this. You've tried this. The other person's going to feel shame. They're going to feel guilty. They're going to be punished. That boss, that pastor, their leader, they're going to see their place. They're going to lose their job. That'll show them. I worked for a technology firm years and years ago. And I'd hired there, and then the recession set in. This was in the early 90s. And I'll never forget because they started laying off their workforce. They laid off like 70%. So I was still one of the few that was left. Not because of, they liked me, but because I had a connection with somebody. And then they cut our salaries. And then they said, well, you're our salesperson, but we are not giving you any budget. You can't travel. You just have to stay home and do everything from your office. Which was, in the industry I was in, was not possible. And what happened over time is this mounting thing that Weldon can't do anything. He's not good at his job. Why do we still have him hired? And everything inside of him, he's like, you're not letting me do my job. This is not me. This is you. I was good at my job, but now you're making me this. And the desire to push back, to retaliate, to say, you're wrong. And I'll never forget when I finally called my boss and said I'm resigning. He said, meet me here, drop off your laptop. That was it. And I thought, oh, I want to tell you something. Right? And that's what we do. We want to retaliate. And here's the funny thing is, when you retaliate, when you defend, you will actually seem courageous. I stood for what's right. I was bold. I stood against the wrong. I proved that you can't push me around. We'll actually seem fair and just. You know, we're not putting up with this unjust treatment. People will, you see yourself as the defender of the faith, the one who's going to stop all heresy. I will not be wronged. It is difficult when you are tempted to throw spears back and everything in you and everyone around you says it's the right thing to do, to not. Your rationality, your sanity, your logic, your intelligence, your common sense, they all agree that responding and retaliating is the right thing to do. And God says, whoa, stop. Retaliation is getting back at instead of getting back with. So if you are thinking, I want to get back at, I want to defend myself so they're wrong, so that they know they're wrong, to prove that I'm right, then you're in retaliation mode. Because what God is inviting is for us to get back into relationship with that person, not to get back. And that's what David does. What retaliation does is actually just makes us just like the people that have thrown the spear at us. That's what it does. But this mistreatment of others can actually lead to inner transformation when I commit and decide ahead of time, I will not retaliate or act defensively. And if you're like me, you're thinking, okay, well, that's fine. But, hold on, we'll get to that. Here's number 2. The other principle in here I see is picture others the way God sees them. And this is so much easier to say than it is to do. Saul tried to kill David very personally. This was not from far away. This wasn't a gossip thing. This was him sitting in the room, taking a spear and trying to skewer him into the wall. He wanted to see David twitching on the wall as he bled out. This is what happened, and it happened multiple times. This is a deeply personal thing. And David now is on the run. He has to get away from Saul. And you know what Saul did? You know what David did not do? Oh, yeah, that's a bad king over there. Oh, yeah. God should have never picked him. He didn't go on the run and grab all his friends and say, you know what? I'm totally with you. I mean, I'm not going to speak bad, but that guy, yeah, we all know what's wrong with him. I don't want to gossip, but I think they got some problems. Like, David's not doing any of that. And when he actually has a chance to retaliate, you know what he said? I will not lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. Despite everything that happened and all the spears that Saul threw, David saw through the actions, he saw through the behaviors, and he saw who Saul had been. He saw and remembered that he had been anointed by God. He remembered the things he had done, that he had been empowered, that he'd been put in the position of king. He'd actually done some good things. And I guarantee you he did not feel emotionally happy with that statement. But he chose to see Saul as God did, and it changed how he acted towards him. That's what kept him from retaliating, from lashing out. See, something changes when we begin to think of people the way God sees them, and begin to picture them the way God pictures them. When we look at people and say, okay, God, what do you see when you see them? What do you see? What do you look at? Like, well, God, when you look at them, what's going on in your mind? And we begin to see that, no, this is how God designed them. They're image bearers of God. They're actually designed in His image. He actually designed them. He built things in them to do that are really good and wonderful. He's created in them ideas and abilities and talents that are amazing, that He wants to use. And this is really, really difficult when they show no signs of cooperating with God. We can do this if they're kind of fighting through things and you kind of see them on the same page as God. But when they show no intentions of cooperating with God, it's really hard to picture him that way. He's just plain evil. She's never going to change. And it gets even harder when their spear throwing continues over and over and over again. But when we practice seeing them, picturing them, what could be, how God designed them, and what could that be like if they actually embraced who God was? It will change how we act. It'll change what we say. It'll change what we do. It'll change how we think. And we might even begin to expand our picture to see the bigger view. Do you know, one of the things that we have trouble with is we think we have the other person all figured out. Do you know how I know this? I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had in my life where someone says to me, oh, I know what they were thinking. Really? Oh, yeah. I mean, they said this, and I know that means something because they're probably saying this, and so I know their history because their history says this, and this is what this is what they're thinking. And of course, because people talk to their pastor, I've often had conversations, and I went, oh, they're completely wrong. And we put ourselves in the position of God that says, I get them, I know their motivations, I know why they're doing what they're doing, I know why they're treating me this way, I know what their problems are. You have stuck yourself in the position of God, and God says, stop doing that. Because David could have said, oh, I know why Saul's like this. I know why Saul went on this. I know why this is a problem. You know, these are all the things I understand, and I know about him. I know why he's doing it. I know the rationale. And David said, not going down that path. Instead, I'm just going to see him the way God sees him, which is as his anointed. See, my mistreatment by others can actually contribute to my inner transformation when I begin to see them the way God sees them. So now I'm not retaliating. I'm forced to kind of look at it differently. And I'm seeing them the way God sees them, which actually changes my heart on the inside. And you think, oh, well, these principles are great, Weldon, but what about, I mean, I don't want to just put myself out there. I don't want to be the guy who stands in the middle of the dodgeball court, and the first person hits me in the face, and I'm like, oh, okay, I love them. And they just stand here like this, and they wait till they throw again, and they hit again. Like, okay, I'll just turn this way, and they get hit in the side of the head. You're like, come on, don't I get away? Like, what do? Do I keep taking the spears? And that's where it gets to number 3. Here's the third principle. Protect your heart ahead of your reputation. If someone had done to you what Saul did to David, how would you feel? How would you feel? You'd feel betrayed. You'd feel angry. You'd feel upset. You'd feel like things weren't fair. The problem that we have as people is that when we take spears or insults or whatever for a long time, it often turns us a deep shade of bitter and cynical and angry. Because we've taken all these hits over and over and over again. All those slings and those arrows, those darts that have been sent to me, it's affected how I view the world. You know, when you do the research on pastors who leave the ministry, one of the reasons that they're the focal point of complaints for years and years. And not just complaints about the world, but complaints about them, complaints about the things they've done wrong, all the things that they aren't doing. And eventually they get so embittered, their hearts get hard, and they finally say, I'm out. I'm done. And people do this in their marriages. They do this in their jobs. They do this with their kids. What's fascinating to me is that despite everything Saul does to David, David's heart stays tender and soft. You see what David did after that second time? Just a little line. That night, David made good his escape. Because he realized, look, I can't just stay here. I can't keep on taking these spears. I mean, if I do this, I am going to die. So I am getting out of here. And so there is nothing wrong with setting boundaries. We set boundaries in our life. I'm not going to keep on putting myself in a position to take these. And so actually, if you read what David does, though, but he never does it alone. I mean, he leaves alone, but he doesn't process this alone. The first thing he does is he goes to his spiritual mentor. He runs to Samuel. Samuel, I don't know what to do. And then the second thing he does, after he talked to Samuel, he goes to his best friend, Jonathan. He says, Jonathan, here's what's going on. And then he goes to a spiritual authority, a priest. He's not trying to process all this alone. He says, I'm going to set boundaries. But hear me, boundaries and barriers are different things. Boundaries are guidelines that said, this is how I'm going to interact with people. Remember, I'm still seeing them the way Jesus did. I'm not retaliating. I'm just setting boundaries. Boundaries are selective, barriers are indiscriminate, and barriers stop everyone and everything, which is what we tend to do. You know what? I'm not going to retaliate. I'm just going to put up these barriers. Nobody's getting in here again. I will not be hurt again. This is not going to happen. I've been hurt too many times. No one's getting that close to me again. I will never open up like that. I'm never going to tell my story again. I'm never going to do this again, because if I do, I run the risk of having another spear thrown at me. David never did that. He said boundaries. But he said, I will not let my heart get hard. Because David could have said easily, you know what, with all that's going on, I'm never trusting another leader in my life. I'm not trusting the king. I'm done with all this. In fact, you know what? I don't even have to live here. I could go somewhere else. I could build a new life in a new country. I don't need to stay here. My family will come along. I'll be done with all this. If he had done that, we would not have the book of Psalms to read every day. Because David said, look, I'm not doing that. I'm not setting up a barrier. I'm going to set boundaries, but you know what, God? I got to leave my heart soft. And so what he does, he was honest with God about his relational hurts and problems. See, David was determined to leave the results of his interaction with Saul in the hands of God and not take it into his own. It's like he said, okay, God, getting Saul out of the way is your business, not mine. You put him there. He's not treating me right. This is what's happening to me. This is how I'm being treated. But since you started his reign, you end it, not me. I'm not going to take advantage of it. And David was more interested in saying, I want to protect my heart than I'm going to protect my reputation. Because his reputation was trashed. Because when he's on the run, what are the people of the kingdom here? Oh, king's after David. David's with a whole bunch of bad guys. And yeah, there were people that still liked him. They remembered him. But his reputation was taking a hit all the time. And David said, it is more important that my heart with God stay soft than I protect my reputation. And that is hard because when people are throwing arrows and our reputation is taking a hit, everything inside says, yeah, but I don't want people to think this of me. If this gets out, what are they going to say? And David goes into it and says, you know what? God, you're big enough to handle all that. And during all those years that followed, all those running, he wrote psalms, he composed music, and some of those honest, gut-wrenching psalms that you read, he wrote right then, in those years. See, the mistreatment we get from others can actually contribute to our inner transformation, because the conflict with others, when we won't retaliate and we don't try and protect our reputation, do you know what that does? That is God's way of using a black light. Have you ever used a black light? Or seen one of those shows where they use a black light in a hotel room? you know those, right? Where the room looks clean. It all looks nice. And then they turn off the lights and they turn on the black light and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm never staying in a hotel room ever again in my life, right? Because there's just, it is nasty and there is stuff all over. You don't know what's happening there. Do you know what? When people start throwing arrows and darts at us, and we say, I will not retaliate. I'm going to keep my heart soft. I'm going to see them the way Jesus did. Do you know what he's doing? He's taking a black light and he's shining it on your soul because there are things you will never see about yourself without that. God says, exactly. There's work to do. You would have never seen this if all your relationships were perfect. David, you would have never become who you were. You would have never written these psalms. You would have never relied on me if I hadn't let Saul throw spears at you. So I get it, it's not nice. It's not fun. You have to live with your reputation kind of being underwater for a little bit. But trust me in this. I'm doing something in you if you cooperate. And this is difficult because we have to do this regardless of whether the other person ever changes. Do you know Saul never did? Never changed. Never got better. In fact, he just broke promises left, right, and center and chased David all the way till the day he died. But David waited, and God took him out in the right way at the right time. By the way, that doesn't necessarily mean that you go home and pray that God would take out your boss. It's probably not the best analogy. However, there is nothing wrong with saying, God, I can't deal with this person anymore. Will you do something? Will you get rid of them? Or change something? I can't do this, but we let God do it. We don't try and take control. There are so many different kinds of spear throwers. There are bitter spear throwers. There's angry ones. There's jealous ones. There's grieving ones. But in the end, my mistreatment by others can actually contribute to my inner transformation. And do you know that Jesus was the ultimate recipient of spear throwing? He was criticized by those who had influence, the ones who had power. His character was maligned. His reputation was wrecked. He was mocked. He was teased. He took shots from religious people all the time. But you know what Peter, who walked through that with him, do you know what he said? Here's what he said about him. He's writing to Christ followers. He says, to this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. In other words, here's what I want you to do. Jesus committed no sin. In other words, he didn't do anything wrong. No deceit was found in his mouth. And when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Jesus trusted God, and he ended up with a literal spear stuck into his side. See, we need to let God be the author of our story. We often want to take the pen and we want to write, but if we avoid retaliation, if we go through this and we say, look, I'm not doing this anymore, I'm not retaliating, I'm not going to go down that path. Even when everything inside of us is screaming out for justice, when we begin to say, you know what, God, I'm going to see them the way you see them. I can't stand them. I don't like what they're doing, but they're still people that you care about, so let me see them the way you see them. I'm going to practice picturing that way. And when we protect our hearts by leaning on Jesus and saying, look, I still want to be soft. I don't want to be hard. I don't want to block people out. I want to be open to you and to others. When we do that, the mistreatment that we receive from other people will actually contribute to our inner transformation. So let me ask you this. What spears are you dodging right now? Or maybe, what spears have struck home with you? Some of those were hurled a long time ago, in your childhood, in your teenage years, by people who were very, very close to you. How can you begin to see those people the way Jesus sees them? Where you don't want to retaliate, but you want to be soft to the Spirit in your life. I think that if we do this, it changes everything. And we will be freed to be the kind of people that we actually want to be. Why don't you stand with me? Let me pray for us, and then let's sing this last song together.